Okay, well, good afternoon, Frank. It's
Good
amazing,
afternoon.
isn't it, that every week there's something in the headlines that gives us a new window on globalization, whether it's good or bad. And I'd been thinking about Irene, and then when I opened the current issue of Knowledge at Wharton this morning in my email, with the Wharton Business e-zine, I saw one of the headlines was "Good night, Irene. Good morning, insurance brokers."
Right, right. It's an interesting thing to note actually, but the insured losses for Irene. Keep in mind how this is being phrased. The losses that are insured that claims will be paid for are estimated to range anywhere from $3.5 billion to $5 billion. Now, the total economic loss and the total actual damages is estimated to be as high as $12 billion. So that means that some $7 billion is going to be uncompensated. That's going to have to be generated internally by businesses or by individuals. A number of people don't, for example, have flood insurance. Certainly people who live in the middle of the state of Vermont don't have flood insurance. Why would they? A number of people who live in the Catskills don't have flood insurance, and so on. Now, the interesting thing from my perspective is that in the same day today, 90-some people in Nigeria have been killed by flooding. Intensive flooding that is overflowing an estuary leading into the Atlantic Ocean, and that's flooding out a number of towns and large-sized villages in that area. The economic loss is anybody's guess, but it's not even on the radar screen because zero of that is insured. Nobody will write a claim. If you look at the giant Haitian earthquake of last year, the economic loss for that was in the billions of dollars. Some 25,000 people or so were killed in that, perhaps more. Yet the insured loss for that was something in the $100 to $150 million range. So it really all depends on where a disaster strikes.
What about Fukushima?
Fukushima is an interesting case. The total insured loss in Japan so far is $30 billion. Now, that's a little bit of a hair-splitting thing because the amount that's going to be covered by commercial insurers is about half that. The balance, or the other 50%, is going to be paid for by the government under the nuclear compensation laws, which call for the Japanese government to pay for any damages relating to any nuclear spillage or radioactive emission that comes from one of the plants. So by hook or by crook, and this is a bit of a game going on now, the carriers are trying their best to get exposures deemed as being radioactive oriented or related to the Fukushima plant so the government can pay for it. Much of the country is covered for tsunami insurance by these internally funded mechanisms called Zencorins, which are cooperatives, some of which are reinsured in the commercial sector. Munich Re, for example, apparently has taken a $2.5 billion hit when one of the Zencorins claim came through as a result of the tsunami, but also some of the tsunami insurance is self-insured by the Japanese government. So there's probably in Japan not going to be a lot of uninsured loss. People will get paid.
What interests me is the degree to which each of these events figures in the global organization of economics, finance, and everything else. And it seems as though there's a different balance between national and private in each one, and that maybe all the OECD countries are pretty well integrated into the global financial network as far as insurance for this sort of natural disaster is concerned. And outside the OECD, probably almost nobody.
Yeah, there's a middle group. Excuse me. There's a middle group that has some commercial coverage. The other thing to remember, as you correctly noted, with the OECD countries, you can pick any OECD country. I mean, if some natural tragedy, for example, befell Belgium, I mean, eventually the Belgian government would say, all right, we have to take care of our citizenry, we have to take care of these people, we're going to find the money and compensate them. Much as what's happened in the U.S. recently in these past 72 hours, you have people who had formerly espoused the Tea Party line, advocating no role for the federal government whatsoever, send them to the moon, now standing up saying the federal government has to stand up and deliver. So we saw that, not that he was a Tea Party guy, but a right-wing New Jersey governor who was bringing President Obama into the state on Sunday to go up to Paterson, New Jersey, begging for federal dollars. So it's a question of these richer countries can do this, and ultimately somebody will pay the bill. As you go down the chain a little bit and you get to that middle level, the money isn't there, and then you go to the bottom level, the money's absolutely not there.
Well, I thought that one interesting angle on this had to do with what's happening to the nation state under globalization in relation to the private sector. And I wondered whether the state wants to cover everything that's not covered under the private sector in order to show how significant the state still is, and whether in fact the amount that's being covered under the private sector is an increasingly large proportion because of the way everything's getting integrated into a global financial network.
That's an interesting observation. There was an article today on the front page of the Insurance Day. There's an annual summer conference held by Nordic insurers and reinsurers, Scandinavian countries, who are always a little bit more forward-thinking perhaps than their colleagues, very, very quick to and early adopters of the global warming scientific theory, or scientific proof now, let's face it. And what they're focusing on now, per this article, is the burgeoning growth of population in cities along the seas, and how the infrastructure is going to be ill-equipped to handle the ultimate rising sea levels, estimating trillions and trillions of dollars of infrastructure investment that's going to be required, and new insurance and reinsurance products that are going to be required to be sold to this class. So it's a funny thing, but the reinsurers and the insurers, this is their milieu. This is where they live. This is how they make money, by pricing the risk. If a risk appears and portrays itself, they're able to quantify it, then they're able to quantify a premium, and if a person is willing to pay that premium, that company or country or he or she is going to be able to be paid in the event of a loss. So they're always looking for losses, because to the extent that they can find something, it's a new product. So to get back to your question, I think that the reinsurers and the insurers are more than perfectly willing to take up global warming risk, as long as A, they're able to quantify it, and B, they can see some sort of government cooperative resolve on a global basis to address it, right? Because nobody wants to stand in the way of a meteorite coming from space and say, well, we'll insure for that. If it's inevitable that ultimately the sea levels are going to rise 50 feet, then that's crazy.
The interesting thing to me is how things get integrated into the global framework. And presumably it has a lot to do with affluence. So nobody's going to involve anything. The Pakistan floods, for example.
Oh, yeah, good.
Nobody there is going to be insured in the private sector because it was in an area where there's not sufficient affluence for that to be possible. And so that's always going to be the nation state. And that's a little bit paradoxical in a way, because the nation state is responsible for infrastructure. It's in the nation states where the government can't provide infrastructure, where people are not going to be protected by anything else. If there is a rise in global in the sea levels globally, that may reinforce the role of nation states, because everybody's going to everywhere depend upon the nation state to do something about the infrastructure. And insurance companies are only going to provide some compensation for damage, but not do anything for the future, for the maintenance of the infrastructure.
Well, I think you're correct. I mean, to the extent that Pakistan is a very good example, actually, because the flooding, which will, of course, will be exacerbated in the future as global warming increases. From an insurance perspective, there's no insurable interest there. There's nobody there that's going to pay a premium, I mean, realistically. So the extent that these disasters continue to befall places that are bereft of insurable interests, those are going to present increasing opportunities for the nation state to rebuild, which of course then allows for tremendous amount of influence to be leveraged by the people who control the nation state to decide what's going to be rebuilt, who's going to be cut out, who's going to be favored. I mean, you could really go to town with that, as you could guess.
So I would say then that if sea levels don't rise too fast, the nation state is going to be subject to weakening of influence, because the private sector will be able to cope. And if global warming and global sea levels increase in speed, then that's going to strengthen state governments and work against globalization and slow it down a bit. I mean, this is the sort of thing that I find particularly interesting, because at the moment what happens to the environment is separated in the media and in scientific literature from what happens to everything else. What's happening to the environment is a disaster that we're criminally disregarding, and we should be doing everything we can to stop environmental change, without any attention to the fact that if we can't manage our own social relationships, we're not going to manage the environment. But in fact, the two are so closely interconnected, and it seems to me that it's impossible to stop environmental change, and the best way to deal with the future possibilities, which insurance is going to be involved in, is to somehow work out a way to integrate environmental management with every other sort of management. And that's an interesting perspective, because environmental management, we have been trying to do that on a global scale at these various conferences in Kyoto and Buenos Aires and various other places. We're not doing very well at it, and of course America is one of the laggards in any attempt to do anything internationally in this regard, but at least the effort is underway.
Well, you could argue that much of the environmental change that is occurring now is the result of the social process, the capitalization process that has been ongoing for the last 100 or so years. And now that that environmental process has inexorably begun to unfold, that now is going to come back and impact the social process.
That's a possibility, and that interchange and continuing change in balance between what the imposition of environmental disasters on us and our imposition of pollution on the environment is an interesting relationship. But it all has to do with the fact that the people who have more power and affluence blame the poor people for causing the problem, whereas the problems actually were all advanced by what's been going on, advancing affluence in the OECD countries, where the insurance industry is.
No, I agree, but it would be hard to tag what's coming environmentally on anybody other than the polluters, I would think. I mean, right?
Well, of course, everybody who tells us that doom is approaching faster and faster thinks in those terms. However, we don't really know. Everything is based on the analysis of incomplete information, because we don't know how to. The problem is timescales. And there's always been environmental change, and we're not sure exactly how continuing environmental change without human impact would affect what's happening with human impact. So I think this provides an argument for the importance of bringing everything together, getting people from totally different fields to talk to each other across what have been scientific and political boundaries, which still happens really very rarely, although it happens much more now than it did before. But also that finance when it became a fully international network, which I suppose started about a generation ago, really does provide a matrix within which we can peg almost anything that happens, and it helps us to understand the relationships between what is going on in different fields. And I've always argued that finance is in fact a measure of what happens socially and historically. Anyway, I think we've run out of time again, so can we finish there?
We certainly can. Well, thank you very much, Professor. Very interesting, as usual.